They called him worthless, a broken man who couldn't even saddle a horse properly. But what they didn't know about the quiet ranch hand mucking stables in the Texas heat was that he carried secrets that would soon demand an audience with fate. The sun blazed mercilessly over the Broken Arrow Ranch as Thaddeus Mackenzie bent over a pile of manure, his weathered hands gripping the shovel handle until his knuckles turned white. Sweat dripped from his graying beard onto the dirt floor of the stable, each drop mingling with years of shame he carried like a phantom limb. At 52, his back ached with every movement, but it was nothing compared to the slow burn of watching younger men treat him as if he were invisible. Jeremiah Caldwell's voice, a rusty hinge in the morning air, sliced through the stable's quiet. The ranch foreman strutted in, his boots striking the wooden planks with the self-importance of a man who'd never faced a true reckoning. His cold gray eyes swept over Mackenzie's work with the condescension usually reserved for a dog relieving itself on a prize rose bush. Caldwell spat a stream of tobacco juice into the hay beside Mackenzie's feet. "Move faster, old man. Mr. Harrison's got important guests coming today, and I won't have this place looking like a pigsty because you can't keep up." His words dripped with a venom that stung far deeper than the indignity of the chore. Mackenzie's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He'd learned long ago that silence was a thick wall against the onslaught of men like Caldwell. The foreman stepped closer, his shadow engulfing the veteran like a shroud. "You hear me talking to you, Mackenzie? Or has all that rot gut finally pickled what's left of your brain?" The other ranch hands gathered at the stable entrance, their laughter echoing off the walls like mockingbirds, observing their daily spectacle. To them, Mackenzie was a convenient punching bag, the broken soldier who'd lost everything and now bartered sweat and muscle for a bunk and scraps. But Mackenzie straightened his shoulders. His steel blue eyes, flecked with the fading embers of a warrior's fire, met Caldwell's stare for a fleeting moment. Something flickered there, a glint of defiance that gave Caldwell pause. It was a silent warning, a whisper of the man he once was. Mackenzie's voice emerged, a low rumble as steady as the foundations of the earth when he finally spoke. "I hear you just fine, Mr. Caldwell." The foreman's face flushed crimson with rage at the quiet defiance. He raised his hand as if to strike, but something in the old man's posture froze him. It wasn't fear exactly, but a primal recognition of dormant power. There was something about the way Mackenzie stood, straight-backed despite his years of labor, shoulders squared like a man who'd stared down the very gates of hell. Instead, Caldwell settled for snatching the shovel from Mackenzie's hands and hurling it across the stable. "Clean this mess up with your bare hands. Maybe that'll beat some respect into you." He turned on his heel and stormed out, his boots a drumbeat of fury against the wooden floor as the laughter of the other workers dissipated into the sweltering afternoon heat. Mackenzie knelt down and began picking up the scattered manure, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear but from the monumental effort it took to restrain the storm raging within. Because buried beneath years of humiliation and shattered dreams resided a man who'd once commanded armies and shaped the very destiny of nations. But none of them knew that the distant thunder of approaching hoofbeats would soon rewrite their perceptions. And when the dust settled, every soul on that ranch would understand precisely who they'd been so casually dismissing. The hoofbeats grew louder, a rhythmic pounding that resonated deep within the earth. Mackenzie's head snapped up, his seasoned ear deciphering a pattern the other ranch hands missed. The unmistakable cadence of military horses moving in precise formation. His heart hammered against his ribs as memories he'd fought to suppress surged to the surface, battlefields painted in fire and blood. Caldwell burst back into the stable, his face etched with a mixture of terror and forced composure. "Mackenzie, get those horses ready, now! We got cavalry coming, and Mr. Harrison wants this place looking picture perfect." The foreman's earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced by the sweaty anxiety of a man whose position hung precariously in the balance. Through the stable doors, Mackenzie could see a swirling vortex of dust on the horizon. The sounds of jangling spurs and creaking leather grew ever closer. His hands moved with a practiced efficiency, instinctively preparing the horses, but his mind was adrift, revisiting the brutal landscapes where that same sound heralded either victory or devastating defeat. The other ranch hands scattered like startled quail, desperate to appear busy, But Mackenzie noticed Caldwell's furtive glances, as if he suspected the old drunkard held a secret he couldn't comprehend. A young ranch hand named Billy stumbled into the stable, his face a mask of nervous excitement. "Mr. Caldwell, sir. There's a whole company of soldiers riding up the main road. The one in front's got more gold braid on his uniform than I ever seen in my life." Caldwell cursed under his breath and seized Mackenzie by the shoulder, his fingers digging in like talons. "Listen to me, old man. You keep your mouth shut when these soldiers get here. Don't embarrass this ranch with your drunken ramblings, you understand?" Mackenzie looked down at Caldwell's hand on his shoulder, then slowly raised his eyes to meet the foreman's gaze. For a fleeting instant, their eyes locked and Caldwell's grip loosened, his confidence wavering. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Caldwell." The sound of horses drawing to a halt outside the stable sent a shiver of anticipation down everyone's spines. Heavy boots hit the ground with military precision, followed by the crisp, authoritative commands of officers. Mackenzie's pulse quickened as he recognized a voice he hadn't heard in over a decade, belonging to a man who'd once served faithfully under his leadership. Caldwell straightened his vest and forced a smile onto his face as he prepared to greet their unexpected guests. "Remember what I said, Mackenzie, not a word." But as the first blue uniform appeared in the stable doorway, Mackenzie felt something stirring within him, something long dormant, something powerful. The officer's bearing, the respect in his voice as he addressed his men, the gleaming brass buttons that caught the sunlight. It all served as a poignant reminder of the man he once was. And when the officer's gaze swept across the stable and lingered on the weathered ranch hand standing in the shadows, Mackenzie saw something that made his blood run cold. Recognition, the kind that held the power to either redeem him or obliterate what remained of his fragile existence. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb stepped into the stable, his polished boots echoing on the wooden floor, each step deliberate, measured. The afternoon sun illuminated the silver eagles on his shoulders, but it was his eyes that commanded attention, intelligent, piercing, and currently fixed on the unassuming figure in the corner. Caldwell rushed forward, a grotesque parody of military decorum, his hands clasped behind his back. "Colonel Webb, sir, welcome to Broken Arrow Ranch. I'm Jeremiah Caldwell, foreman of this fine establishment. How can we be of service to the United States Army?" Webb's gaze remained fixed on Mackenzie, who stood motionless, his hands continuing their menial labor with a robotic precision. The colonel's face betrayed no emotion, but a flicker of surprise, confusion, and something akin to profound sadness registered in his eyes. "We're conducting a survey of local resources for a planned fort construction," Webb stated, his voice resonating with authority. "We'll need to assess your livestock, water supply." His words trailed off as Mackenzie slowly turned to face him. The two men stood frozen, separated by the dusty space, and time itself seemed to grind to a halt. Webb's face paled visibly, his mouth agape as if he were confronted by a ghost from a long-forgotten war. Mackenzie straightened, and for a brief, transformative moment, the broken ranch hand vanished, replaced by something that made the very air crackle with energy. Caldwell, oblivious to the palpable tension, continued his obsequious performance. "Of course, Colonel, whatever the Army needs, we're happy to provide. Though I should mention that some of our personnel aren't exactly reliable." He shot a pointed glance at Mackenzie. "We've got this old drunk here who causes more trouble than he's worth." Webb's jaw tightened, his eyes still locked on Mackenzie's. His voice, when he spoke, was a carefully controlled weapon. "Is that so, Mr. Caldwell? And what precisely makes you think this man is unreliable?" The question hung in the air, thick and heavy. Mackenzie felt his heart pounding in his chest as he watched Webb's expression shift from shock to something that resembled righteous anger. Not at him, but at the circumstances he'd stumbled upon. Caldwell, emboldened by what he misinterpreted as interest, eagerly elaborated. "Well, sir, he's just a washed-up old soldier who can't handle his liquor. Likely saw too much action in the war. We keep him around out of the goodness of our hearts. But he's more trouble than he's worth." The silence that followed was absolute. Webb's hands clenched into fists, the vein in his temple throbbing visibly. The young officer behind Webb looked bewildered, his gaze darting between his commander and the weathered ranch hand. Webb took a step forward, his voice dropping to a bare whisper. "Mr. Caldwell, I think there's something you should know about your washed-up old soldier." Mackenzie shook his head almost imperceptibly, a silent plea for Webb to let sleeping dogs lie, but the colonel had already made his decision. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and everything Mackenzie had painstakingly hidden was about to be laid bare. Webb's voice resonated through the stable like a thunderclap. "Mr. Caldwell, the man you just dismissed as a useless drunk is Colonel Thaddeus Mackenzie. The very same Colonel Mackenzie who held Antietam Creek for 3 days against impossible odds. The man who personally saved my life and the lives of over 200 soldiers under his command." The words struck Caldwell with the force of a physical blow. The smug facade crumbled, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The other ranch hands, who had eagerly anticipated a humiliating spectacle, suddenly found their boots fascinating, shuffling backward as if trying to distance themselves from the impending fallout. Mackenzie closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. A decade of meticulous anonymity had evaporated like mist in the desert sun. He had painstakingly constructed a new identity, a shield of invisibility, but it was now shattering, exposing the raw, unhealed wounds beneath. Caldwell's voice was a strangled whisper. But you're just what?" Webb stepped closer, his voice laced with barely suppressed rage. "Just a man who gave everything for his country? Just a hero who sacrificed his family, his fortune, and his reputation because politicians needed a scapegoat for their failures?" The younger officer behind Webb snapped to attention, his eyes wide with comprehension. Even the horses seemed to sense the dramatic shift in the atmosphere, snorting and stamping nervously in their stalls. Mackenzie stood frozen, watching his carefully constructed life disintegrate. Caldwell's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He looked from Webb to Mackenzie and back again, struggling to reconcile the impossible truth. This man, whom he had treated with such contempt, was a decorated war hero, a legendary figure who had commanded armies and altered the course of history. I didn't know," Caldwell stammered, sweat pouring down his face. "He never said. How was I supposed to?" Mackenzie finally spoke, his voice rough and strained. "Because I didn't want you to know, Marcus. I came here to disappear, not to be resurrected." His eyes met Webb's, conveying a mixture of gratitude and profound regret. Some secrets, he seemed to say, were better left buried. But Webb shook his head firmly. "Not this, Thaddeus, not you." He turned back to Caldwell, his voice ringing with military authority. This man single-handedly changed the tide of the war. When others faltered, he stood resolute. When he was betrayed by those in power, he bore it with unparalleled dignity. The ranch hands began whispering amongst themselves, their voices a mixture of awe and apprehension. Some were veterans themselves, familiar with the whispered legends of the war, and they now realized they had been working alongside a living embodiment of those tales. Mackenzie straightened his shoulders, and for the first time in years, the shadow of the great man he once was flickered across his features. Caldwell collapsed to his knees in the hay-strewn stable floor, his body convulsing like a man possessed. The sight of the arrogant foreman groveling sent shockwaves through the assembled ranch hands. Words poured from his mouth in a torrent of desperation. "Colonel Mackenzie, sir, I had no idea. Please, you must understand, I never would have treated you this way if I'd known who you were." Mackenzie looked down at the man who had made his life a living hell for the past 3 years, and something unexpected stirred within him. Not triumph, not vengeance, but a deep, profound sadness. "Get up, Caldwell. A man shouldn't debase himself in the dirt regardless of his transgressions." But Caldwell remained on his knees, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I called you worthless. I forced you to clean stables with your bare hands. I treated a war hero like a man who had lost everything," Mackenzie finished quietly, "which is precisely what I was, what I still am." He extended his hand to help Caldwell to his feet, but the foreman recoiled, as if he didn't deserve even such a simple act of kindness. Webb watched the unfolding scene with a palpable wave of emotion. Behind him, more soldiers had gathered at the stable entrance, drawn by the commotion. As word spread that they were in the presence of the legendary Colonel Mackenzie, the whispers intensified. Some of the younger soldiers had heard the stories from their fathers, tales of incredible valor and heartbreaking sacrifice. Young Billy, the ranch hand who had announced the cavalry's arrival, stepped forward, tears welling in his eyes. "Colonel, sir, my pa fought at Antietam. He always said there was an officer who saved his entire regiment when they got pinned down by Confederate artillery. That was you, wasn't it? Mackenzie's throat constricted. He remembered that day vividly. The screams of the wounded, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the agonizing choice between retreat and annihilation. Your father was a brave man, son. They all were. The stable had transformed into a hallowed space, a place where ordinary men stood in the presence of living history. But the weight of the moment threatened to overwhelm Mackenzie. He had spent a decade trying to forget, to erase his past, and now it was crashing down upon him like a tidal wave. Webb stepped closer, his voice a balm to Mackenzie's ravaged soul. Thaddeus, you can't continue to hide from who you are. These men deserve to know that they've been working alongside a genuine American hero. Mackenzie's hands clenched into fists. Hero? His voice cracked with a hint of bitterness. Marcus, do you know what I've been doing for the past 10 years? Drinking myself into oblivion every night, desperately trying to forget the faces of the men who died because of my orders, existing in flop houses and working for men like Caldwell because I couldn't bear to face a world that had moved on without me. The silence stretched like a taut wire, threatening to snap at any moment. Every man in the stable could feel the crushing weight of Mackenzie's pain, the suffocating burden of survivor's guilt that had driven him into self-imposed exile. But they could also discern something else, the unyielding core of honor that had sustained him through unimaginable horrors. Webb's voice, resonant with unwavering conviction, cut through the suffocating atmosphere. And yet here you stand, still fighting, even if it's only against the demons within yourself. He turned to address the assembled men. That, gentleman, is the true definition of a hero. Not the absence of fear or pain, but the unyielding courage to persevere in spite of them. But Mackenzie wasn't finished. The floodgates had been breached, and years of pent-up emotion were now pouring forth in a torrent. What he said next would either complete his redemption or shatter him beyond repair. Mackenzie's voice cracked, raw and vulnerable. You want to know why I vanished, Marcus? Why I allowed everyone to assume I was dead? It's because in my heart, I believe I should be. Every man who perished under my command should be standing here instead of me. I survived when they didn't, and that's a burden I'll carry to my grave. The stable fell silent, save for the gentle snorting of the horses and the whisper of the wind through the eaves. Webb's face grew pale, comprehension dawning in his eyes. For years, he had wondered why his exceptional commanding officer had simply vanished after the war, why a man of Mackenzie's talent and valor had seemingly dissolved into the vastness of the frontier. Webb said softly, What transpired at Petersburg wasn't your fault. The intelligence was flawed, and no one could have foreseen the trap. Stop! Mackenzie's voice cut through the air like a shard of glass. Don't you dare try to absolve me of my responsibility. I led 200 boys into a slaughter because I blindly trusted outdated information. I watched them die because I was too proud to admit I might be wrong. Caldwell, still kneeling in the dirt, looked up with confusion. Colonel, what are you talking about? Petersburg? That wasn't part of any of the stories I've heard. Webb closed his eyes, understanding the unbearable weight that his former commander had been carrying in silence. He knew that Mackenzie's actions had saved countless lives, but it was clear that even a lifetime of heroism could not erase the memory of that one terrible mistake. But Mackenzie shook his head vehemently, his hands trembling with the intensity of the memories. Those boys had families, Marcus. Wives who waited for letters that never arrived. Children who grew up without fathers because I was too stubborn to question orders from Washington. Young Billy stepped forward, his voice barely audible. Sir, my older brother died at Petersburg. Tommy Garrison. He was only 19. The words hung in the air like a death knell, and Mackenzie felt his knees buckle. I am so sorry, Mackenzie whispered, the words inadequate but heartfelt. God forgive me, I am truly sorry. But Billy surprised everyone by stepping closer, his young face etched with a solemnity beyond his years. Colonel, sir, Tommy wrote to us before that battle. He said his commanding officer was the finest man he had ever known. He said you always visited the wounded, and that you knew every soldier's name. He was proud to serve under you, even in the face of death. The revelation struck Mackenzie with the force of a physical blow. He staggered backward, catching himself against a wooden post as tears he had suppressed for a decade finally broke free. Around the stable, hardened men wiped their eyes, understanding for the first time the true cost of war. not just for those who died, but for those who were burdened with the responsibility of command. Webb stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. That is what they never tell you about heroes, isn't it? That sometimes surviving is the hardest battle of all. Mackenzie looked around at the faces surrounding him. Caldwell still kneeling in the dirt. The ranch hands now regarding him with newfound respect. The soldiers who had heard the legends but were now seeing the broken man behind them. He stood at a pivotal point, and the path he chose would determine whether he remained a haunted relic of the past or finally found a way to live with his ghosts. The sound of approaching horses shattered the fragile silence, but this time the hoofbeats were different, urgent, desperate. Someone was riding hard toward the ranch, carrying news that would undoubtedly alter their destinies once more. A lone rider burst through the ranch gates, his horse lathered in sweat and its flanks heaving. The man in the saddle wore the uniform of a cavalry scout, his face contorted with an urgency that signaled imminent danger. He pulled up sharply outside the stable, dust swirling around his mount as he leaped to the ground. "Colonel Webb!" the scout shouted, his voice hoarse. "Sir, we've got trouble! Big trouble!" He rushed into the stable, his eyes darting frantically until he found his commanding officer amidst the assembled men. Webb snapped into military mode, his personal emotions instantly suppressed. "Report, Sergeant Morrison. What is the situation?" Morrison glanced nervously at the civilians, but Webb waved him on. "Speak freely, Sergeant. What has happened?" "Sir, it's the Apache. Chief Running Bear has broken out of the reservation with approximately 50 warriors. They struck the Whitman homestead 2 hours ago, massacred the entire family except for a young girl. She managed to hide and escape, but..." Morrison's voice cracked. "Sir, they're headed this way. Our scouts estimate they will reach this area by sundown." The blood drained from every face in the stable. Apache raids were the stuff of frontier nightmares, swift, brutal, and utterly merciless. Caldwell scrambled to his feet, his earlier humiliation forgotten in the face of mortal peril. "How far out are they?" Webb demanded, his mind already calculating distances and potential defensive positions. "Approximately 3 hours, sir, but there's more." Morrison hesitated, glancing again at the civilians. "They are not merely raiding indiscriminately. Rumor has it Running Bear is looking for someone in particular, someone who fought against his brother at Canyon Creek 5 years ago." Mackenzie felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Canyon Creek. The name reverberated through him like a thunderclap, resurrecting memories he had fought tooth and nail to bury. His hands began to tremble as he recalled the desperate battle in the narrow canyon, the overwhelming odds, and the agonizing choice he had been forced to make. Webb's eyes snapped to Mackenzie, realization flooding his features. "Thaddeus, Canyon Creek. That was you, wasn't it? You led that operation." Mackenzie nodded slowly, his voice barely audible. "Running Bear's brother was Chief Stonewolf. I had to choose between letting my men be slaughtered or..." The words choked in his throat, the weight of that day, the decision that had saved 40 soldiers but cost the life of a respected chief, pressing down upon him like a suffocating shroud. "Sir," Morrison continued urgently, "the Apache have been asking questions at every settlement they've hit. They know he's out here somewhere. They know about the colonel." Caldwell's face turned ashen. "You brought this down on us. Your past is going to get us all killed." But before anyone could react, young Billy stepped forward, his jaw tight with determination. "Then we fight. We won't surrender a hero to save our own hides." The other ranch hands murmured in agreement, but Webb shook his head grimly. "Gentlemen, you don't comprehend the gravity of the situation. 50 Apache warriors against a handful of soldiers and civilians? Those aren't fighting odds. That's a death sentence." Mackenzie straightened slowly, and for the first time since Webb had arrived, he looked every inch the colonel he once was. His voice was steady, resonating with a command presence that no amount of self-inflicted humiliation could extinguish. "Then I'll ride out to meet them. I'll end this before it starts." "Like hell you will," Webb retorted sharply. "I didn't find you again just to witness you throw your life away on some misguided notion of atonement." Outside, the afternoon sun was sinking toward the horizon. Time was running out, and somewhere in the distance, 50 Apache warriors rode relentlessly toward a reckoning that had been 10 years in the making. Mackenzie stood at the epicenter of it all, confronted with the most difficult choice of his life. Save himself and condemn innocent people to a horrific fate, or confront his past head-on and hope that he was still the man who had once stood against impossible odds. The sound of weapons being checked and loaded filled the stable, as every man braced for what might be his final stand. Mackenzie walked out of the stable into the fading light, his weathered hands steady as he inspected his rifle one last time. Behind him, Webb's soldiers and the ranch hands formed a makeshift defensive line, but they all recognized the grim truth. They were preparing for a massacre, not a battle. The Apache materialized on the ridge like phantoms conjured from the land itself. 50 warriors on horseback, their faces painted for war, their eyes burning with vengeance, formed a crescent moon around the ranch. At their head rode Chief Running Bear, his expression a mask of controlled fury. His gaze swept across the ranch below until it locked onto the figure of the man he had been hunting for half a decade. Mackenzie advanced, his boots crunching on the dusty ground as he moved away from the others. Each step felt like wading through treacle, but his posture remained ramrod straight, his head held high. He was done running. "Running Bear!" Mackenzie's voice carried across the distance, unwavering despite the turmoil within. "You want me? Here I am. These people had nothing to do with Canyon Creek. Let them live and we'll resolve this between us." The Apache chief spurred his horse forward, stopping 50 yards away. When he spoke, his English was flawless, but laced with an edge of menace that made every word feel like a curse. "Colonel Mackenzie, the man who murdered my brother with his own hands, the man who desecrated the sacred trust of Parley and butchered Stonewolf under a white flag." Mackenzie felt the accusation strike him like a physical blow. Behind him, he heard Webb's sharp intake of breath. The soldiers had heard whispers about Canyon Creek, but never the full, unvarnished truth. "That's not how it happened," Mackenzie replied, his voice steady despite the crushing weight of his guilt. "And you know it." "Then tell me what happened," Running Bear demanded, his horse snorting nervously. "Tell these men why Stonewolf perished when he came to negotiate peace." Mackenzie drew a deep breath, each word extracted from the depths of his soul. "Your brother came to Parley, yes, but he also concealed 20 warriors in the rocks above. When my scout discovered them, he drew his knife. I had a choice between sacrificing my men and maintaining the peace. I chose my men. I have regretted that choice every day since." Running Bear's face remained impassive, but Mackenzie detected a flicker in his dark eyes. "And now? What choice do you make now?" Mackenzie slowly unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the ground. "I choose to end this cycle of violence. Take me, but spare these innocent people. They bear no responsibility for the sins of my past." For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the ranch buildings. Then Running Bear raised his hand, and the circle of warriors lowered their weapons. "You speak the truth, Colonel. Stonewolf would have done the same to protect his people. There has been too much death between us." The Apache chief wheeled his horse around and led his warriors back into the darkness, leaving Mackenzie standing alone in the dust, finally liberated from the ghost that had haunted him for so long. As Webb and the others rushed to his side, Mackenzie realized something had changed within him. The weight of command, the burden of agonizing decisions. They were still there, but now he could carry them without being destroyed. Mackenzie never returned to working as a ranch hand. Webb persuaded him to accept a position training young officers at Fort Davis, where his invaluable experience could save lives instead of tormenting him. Caldwell became his most unlikely ally, transforming the Broken Arrow Ranch into a haven for veterans struggling with their own inner demons. And sometimes, on clear desert nights, they would observe smoke signals rising in the distance. Running Bear's people living in peace, honoring the courage of an old soldier who had finally learned to forgive himself. So, what started as a tale of a broken man's hidden past transformed into a testament to forgiveness, redemption, and the enduring power of honor. It reminds us that even when buried beneath layers of regret and shame, a spark of courage and compassion can still ignite, changing not only our own lives, but the lives of those around us. Ultimately, Colonel Mackenzie's story is a beautiful reminder that even the deepest wounds can heal, and that true strength lies not in avoiding our past, but in facing it with humility and a willingness to make amends. What did you think? Did Mackenzie make the right choice? What would you have done in his situation? We'd love to hear your thoughts, questions, and interpretations in the comments below. Let's get a conversation going. And if you enjoyed this journey into the heart of the Old West and want to explore more stories of heroism and resilience, don't forget to subscribe. That way, you won't miss out on our future explorations of compelling characters and the timeless lessons they teach us. Thanks for watching.